We are very glad and proud to have Dr. Virginia Lombardo Arbery here with us today. Her husband is also sitting here, and we welcome him too. Virginia Lombardo Arbery holds a doctorate in political philosophy from the University of Dallas, a Richard Weaver Fellow and a Fellow of the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture. She has taught at the University of Dallas, Thomas More College of Liberal Arts, the St. Anselm College, Austin College, the University of Texas at Dallas, and at Assumption College. She has served as Dean of Admissions at the University of Dallas, University of St. Thomas in Houston, at the Thomas More College, and at the Thomas More College. While on the faculty of the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture, she co-authored and directed a grant from the U.S. Department of Education. She ran a nationally acclaimed program to educate high school teachers in American founding documents. A former consultant to the National Center for Founding Documents at Boston University, she has written and lectured extensively on the role of George Washington in the American founding. Professor Arbery has also published on Greek and Southern literature, on Rousseau, on women's studies, on American education, and on life issues. She has conducted numerous continuing legal education programs for lawyers, as well as leadership seminars for corporate executives. She is on the lecture bureau of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. In 2010, Professor Arbery, with her husband, was awarded the Russell Kirk Paideia 2010 prize for a lifetime achievement in the humanities. Currently, she is an associate professor of humanities at Wyoming Catholic College in Lander, Wyoming. Please greet Professor Virginia Arbery.
Thank you, Professor McCadden. And thank you to ITAM for welcoming us from the hinterland, from the wilderness. There is nothing in Wyoming except horses, deer, antelope, and sheep, and a few people who study the humanities like you in Lander, Wyoming. This is our first time to visit our great neighbor, whose cultural roots we share and whose kinship we celebrate in so many ways. And there are so many people here and so many cars. I thought I was from a big city. I'm from Chicago. I think Chicago is tiny compared to Mexico City. Mindful of what a responsibility it is to address you students at ITAM, I hope to increase your desire to study the humanities. Of course, your studies in accounting, engineering, economics, computer science, business, international relations, and other fields are of great practical importance. Your institute, however, recognizes that these degrees, while they affect our culture every day in so many useful ways, benefit deeply from young professionals who have dialogued with Socrates, who have listened to Aristotle, suffered with Oedipus, and who with Antigone have stood up to the Creons of the world. That it is important to have young men and women who have rested with Augustine in that beauty so ancient and so new. So I trust you will accept the purpose of my talk. I aim to diagnose a symptom of a diseased culture. That disease could best be described as a loss of leisure and an exclusive attachment to economic utility. Toward the end of the lecture, I will talk about a recent book by a Harvard professor, Michael Sandel, What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of the Markets, where he piles example upon example of how the commodification of our lives degrades and sometimes corrupts us. Assigning monetary values to areas which by nature are sovereign and even sacred is so prevalent that we hardly even notice anymore. We are past shocking. But this symptom, though chronic, of reducing everything to economic utility need not be fatal. It can be healed by revisiting the classical notion that leisure is the basis of culture, and by protecting that domain of leisure, the university should be the healer. I'll provide some background, both historic and personal. First, the historic. In the decade just after World War II, when Europe was frantically rebuilding and reconstituting its order, the philosopher Josef Pieper wrote a book by the title, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. He observed that in the Herculean efforts to rebuild, the citizens of Western Europe, the nations, were jeopardizing the very foundations upon which a free and fully human life can flourish. As the standard of hard work was raised, joy, feasting, and the contemplative life were diminished. Pieper observed that in rebuilding their material world, Europeans were losing the regard for leisure that had protected their inner life, the life of free men and women. The noise of rising skyscrapers dulled the inner senses, the window to the soul, where the fruitful silences that restore life, silences nurtured by leisure, were threatened with extinction. Now, it is probably presumptuous of me to speak about leisure. I am the mother of 8 children. I'm the grandmother of 10, but called to the intellectual life, I have been teaching for nearly 40 years. During those years, I knew little rest. I didn't have a maid while changing diapers, keeping up with the laundry, cooking, cleaning, and even doing dishes when my husband didn't do them. He didn't change the diapers that much, and he didn't have to nurse them. I would say I owe everything to him, though, because he made it possible for me to do both the academic life and to be my privileged calling, the calling of a mother. But I used to mutter to myself a poem from Ogden Nash. You must not know this poet, but he's very, very funny. And it was this line, "O duty, why art thou not a sweetie or a cutie?" If anyone had asked me during that time, "Do you have much leisure, Virginia?" I would have had to answer, "Are you crazy?" Anyone could see that I had little downtime, as we say in the States. But I regarded the space to think, to reflect, to muse, as a gift, and the classroom was my playground. But who would believe such an answer? When I read Josef Pieper's book in graduate school, I learned that the Greek word for culture, paideia, comes from the root word for child and play. It was a liberating piece of information, transforming my undergraduate years of hard work, getting the best grades, to a realm of play. At any rate, I assume that you students prefer leisure over busyness. If you're like most students, you probably associate leisure with living for the weekend or with vacations. What I mean by leisure is not mere diversion or relaxation or entertainment. No, these are escapes from work that's programmed so that you can return to work even harder. The leisure I'm going to talk about is abiding, generous, and liberating. This kind of leisure is critical to your academic success, to your personal fulfillment, and to the health of our culture. It is the classical and medieval view of leisure, likely unfamiliar to you, for it holds that being a student means not to be busy, not to feel overworked, and not to be burdened with chores and tasks. Leisure, not work, I learned, was at the center of the human enterprise. Aristotle's statement that you've read, we work so we can have leisure, might seem alien, even immoral, if, like most students, you misinterpret Aristotle to mean we live for the weekend. He meant contemplation, impossible without leisure, the philosophic life. Even participation in political life was possible only for those who were free, liberally educated, released from the drudgery of manual or the servile arts. Indeed, the Greek word for leisure, skole, is the same as the English word for school. So schoolwork is leisure work, and only those who have leisure are free to think about the common good. At our little quaint school in Wyoming, the students are forbidden to have cell phones. And it's become very famous on the news because the argument, the reasoning goes, without the cell phone, they have the freedom to think about what the lecture has given them, to discuss it, to look in the eyes, not of the screen, but of the person next to them, and talk about those wonderful images and ideas of the lecture. And it's been a great boon to community, because language, all of it that pummels us all the time, so much stimulation, may make it possible for us to communicate, but communication is not the same thing as communion, which we might have lost. We should pause for a minute to think about thinking. The Middle Ages divided thinking into the exercise of ratio, discursive logical thought, and intellectus, intuition, the divine capacity in men to see things as they are from the inside. As Pieper writes, intellectus is that simple vision to which truth offers itself like a landscape to the eye. Ratio is more active, a human capacity, whereas intellectus, or intuition, requires receptivity, attentiveness, one might say passivity. It is beyond the human capacity. It participates in the divine, intellectus. The modern thinkers respond, no, objecting to intellectus as a mode of knowledge. They say that real knowledge is useful. Intuitions are fantasies. They fail to make us masters of nature and politics. Rather, we must be productive, hardworking, as John Locke wrote, for productivity is the measure of our humanity. Even virtue and thought must be hard, or if it's easy, if it comes to us as a landscape to the eye, it's not genuine. Pieper contrasts this with Thomas Aquinas' view. Thomas writes, "The essence of virtue consists in the good rather than the difficult." Reading Pieper's powerful response to this all-encompassing work ethic of which I was a part ushered me into a welcome awareness. As he puts it, the inmost significance of the exaggerated value which is placed upon hard work appears to be this: man seems to mistrust everything that is effortless. He can only enjoy with a good conscience what he has acquired with toil and trouble. He refuses anything as a gift. We should take a few minutes to consider what receiving a gift means. First, we can all agree that being a student does require labor. But labor is different from work, from an attitude that reduces your intellectual pursuits into merely getting your assignments done, even if they're done very well. The gift of learning should not be a chore, an ordeal. If neither intuition, that is intellectus, nor virtue is trustworthy, then the beautiful and the unearned truths by which men have lived and for which some have died are foolish, even baffling. With Creon, we should dismiss Antigone's higher law as mere defiance and leave her brother unburied, to be eaten by the birds. With Crito, we should try to persuade Socrates that it is better to bribe the jailers and escape to Thessaly than to suffer the injustice of the Athenians' verdict. With Kant, we should correct the Romantic thinkers who appreciated the gratuitous nature of insight and respond with Kant's dictate that the law is that reason acquires its possessions through work. Thus, a slavish and illiberal attitude claims that its weighty goals are serious, and all authentic thinking is dubbed intellectual work. But the unmerited gifts of the highest thoughts and deeds are refused because one cannot legitimately claim to have acquired them or done them through hard work. You'll remember in the beautiful play Antigone by Sophocles that when she explains why she risked her life and the death sentence by disobeying Creon's injunction and trying to bury her brother, she has only one thing to say. She said, "I did it because it was a beautiful thing to do." In his marvelous book, The Gift, Imagination and the Erotic Life of Property, Lewis Hyde offers some helpful distinctions between work and labor. First, work is what we do by the hour, right? It's governed by time. Wages are paid often, right, by the hour. Work is an intended activity that is accomplished by the will. Labor, on the other hand, though it might result in an honorarium or be assigned a monetary value, labor refuses to be quantified. We labor at creating a poem, throwing a pot, composing a sonata, or discovering string theory. Things get done, he writes, but we often have the odd sense that we didn't do them. We might even seem to be asleep when the poem gets finished or the pot takes on just the right glaze. I read recently in the paper that Paul McCartney Everybody knows Paul McCartney. The Beatles? I don't know. I mean, that's my generation. He's, always trying to reinvent himself. And he recently revealed that I think his best song, Yesterday, was one that he doesn't remember working to write. He said, I got out of bed one morning, and there it was, and I wrote it down. It makes me think of that passage from Job, in the Bible, that God gives songs in the night. So we sometimes awaken to see what our wakeful thinking or efforts cannot reveal. Labor, Hyde goes on to show, participates in a gift economy, as opposed to an exchange or a money economy. He writes, the labor of gratitude is the middle term in the passage of a gift. It is wholly different from obligation. We often feel an obligation when we accept something that we don't really want, right? An obligation can be discharged with an act of the will. But a gift that has the power to change us awakens a part of the soul. We cannot receive the gift until we can meet it as an equal. We therefore submit ourselves to the labor of becoming like the gift. Do you remember the scene in the Iliad, Homer's great epic in Book 12, where Sarpedon, a Lycian who's volunteered to help the Trojans, you remember, thank you, is talking to a fellow Lycian. And they're about to go into a fierce battle without Achilles, which means they're in trouble. But Glaucus says, why are we doing this? We're not even Trojans. And Sarpedon says something to the effect that before we're even born, we're given the best lands, the best fruits, the best things in life. And so we must labor to show, through even risking our lives, that we are worthy of these gifts. So that's the idea of the labor of gratitude. Your work is different. It's done and it's over. Your labor is a life's work, you might say. It's how you view your response to the gift of what you've been given. First your life, and then all the talents. After receiving the gift and striving to be equal to it through the labor of gratitude, we are ready to give a gift in return. Thus, rather than accounting, balance sheets, bottom lines, the fruits of the gift economy are liberality, generosity, and sometimes magnanimity. Compare the two. A strong worth ethic encourages us to become successful. That's good. I hope you're all successful. I'm not. There's, in the world's eyes, I'm not. Our culture rewards success. Fine. However, ignoring the labor of gratitude, major universities, in eliminating classic texts from the curriculum, right? Not yours, but others, have closed off key transformative moments that for generations have awakened hearts and minds. They have blocked, these universities, the neophytes' ascent up Plato's ladder of love, shuttered the eyes of college students from pitying the blind Oedipus, whose acceptance of suffering leads him to a knowledge, a kind of knowledge he could never find out for looking after the facts. During another example from your own curriculum, you witnessed, didn't you, that amazing heavenly conversation between Augustine and Monica as they overlook their garden in Ostia? A spiritual knowledge, one richly part of our heritage, a heritage that goes untasted in many universities. It seems to me that we must admit there is a problem, especially for democracies, in following the Kantian emphasis on ratio and intellectual work. As the political philosopher Harry Jaffa once observed, a democratic people often mistakenly identify their desires with their needs. We might ask ourselves whether when the mind focuses on marketing, we think too much about what we desire or what others want us to desire. Politicians market desires as though they were our needs, and our cultural life grows ever more agitated and restless. We become proletariat in our concerns. At the same time that our intellectual and spiritual aspirations are deflated and rendered horizontal, losing that vertical dimension, that movement upward that calls us beyond our needs, beyond our desires, a call that once answered gave our culture its heroes, its saints, and its lovers. We could aptly cite an observation, contemporary observation of Ignatius of Loyola in the 16th century, who the modern observer said used more vivid language than our contemporaries. And this observer went on to say, even the saints of our day speak in less radiant language, and sanctity shows shorn of its rays through the black fog of universal utilitarianism, the materiality which men have drawn into the very lungs of their souls. I would call this spiritual pollution. Asceticism, sacrifice, and spiritual freedom, rather than acquisitions, safety, and fortunes, would be the signs of a restored culture. Now, we might justifiably ask ourselves whether the Academy has indeed sold out to the purveyors of tangible goods, enterprises, and skills, such that the university is content to be owned by the world on its own terms. If this is the case in 2013, and there is good reason to think that it is, then a truly humanistic program of studies is countercultural. When a curriculum refuses to be governed by the dominant pressure of economic utility, some might charge that it is out of step, impractical, and worthless, even irresponsible. But I would respond that economic utility is the enemy of academic freedom. When the Academy fulfills its high purpose, it stirs wonder in the students. Or as Aristotle writes, wonder is the companion of poetry and philosophy. The guidance of the human order that they provide endures and will endure long after global economies crash and technologies become obsolete. And who, I ask you, will be equipped to both understand and imagine how to guide society if the scale of life outgrows the human good, as Rome once did, and as perhaps we have already done? The Academy should not be the pawn of those who would merely use it to produce workers in their enterprises. Surely university leaders cannot afford to be short-sighted, for if they cannot protect the purpose of higher education from being used by economic forces, the university will collapse with those forces. The Academy must look to the permanent things or go down with the temporary ones. Unless thinking leaves the ranks of the proletariat, our humanity is at stake. In placing the academy outside of utility, I am guided by Aristotle's comment in the Politics that to seek everywhere the element of utility is least of all fitting for those who are magnanimous and free. Only a liberal education gives a large space for inspiration and for the revelation of what William Faulkner called the verities in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech. Love, honor, pity, pride, sacrifice. He writes, until the young man or woman writing relearns those things, he will write as though he stood among and watched the end of man. This was 1950. He continued, I decline to accept the end of man. I believe that man will not merely endure, he will prevail. He is immortal, not because he alone among creatures has an inexhaustible voice, but because he has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion, of sacrifice and endurance. In committing itself then to the reading of classic texts, the Academy can best transmit these verities and reset the sights of our culture beyond economic utility. Now we could go back in modernity, I think, to Bacon, Francis Bacon, who wanted to, wrest nature's secrets from her and to bring about a kind of, in his view, reformation of philosophy, so that it no longer was the study of things for their own sake, but it was now the study of things for man's commodious living, for the utility of the human enterprise. So, we could think of Bacon in modernity as the rector of the modern university. And we could go back further in order to understand economic utility, of course, to Epicurus in the ancient world, who built his philosophy clearly around a utilitarian view, right? He saw no vista beyond the here and now, a peaceful present, free from fear and pain. But it is Niccolò Machiavelli who introduces, as he puts it, new modes and orders, and then gives us the modern project. I want to look at him briefly and two English thinkers who follow his lead in order to analyze the roots of this economic utilitarian perspective. So first, Machiavelli. He assures us in The Prince, I think it's already in Book 3, that it's a natural and ordinary desire to acquire, right? So he wants to undercut that notion of going after a good life in a material way, undercut that notion that that is an insufficient life by giving it credibility. It's natural, it's ordinary to desire. Right? There's no telos, however, in Machiavelli for desire, no proper end to it. You recall in Book 15 that he rejects those ideal republics, such as Plato's, as incapable of delivering la verità effettuale, right? The effectual truth. The Prince has one sin and one sin only, not to be effectual. He rejects the classical medieval synthesis then, the older ethic in his new modes and order. The ought is in the imagination, the is the way things are. That is what should govern our choices. And what is the useful? If you remember your Machiavelli, whatever works. His rule of prudence is doing the least bad as good when it is convenient to do so. So a prudent lord, a prudent politician, a prudent CEO need not be bound by his promises. However, he must appear to be virtuous in the old sense. The defense for such an amoral teaching is, and if all men were good, this teaching would not be good. But because men are wicked and do not observe faith with you, you do not have to observe it with them. The old ethics is simply impracticable. Only an irresponsible ruler would adhere to Plato, Aristotle, or Aquinas. Then, of course, Thomas Hobbes, in his Leviathan, overtly rejects Aristotle's paradigms, ethics, politics, and metaphysics, and replaces it with a new psychology that undermines the love of the noble for its own sake. He exposes it as a fiction, right? The real objective for human beings is power. And man's desire for power goes hand in hand with his desire for what? Peace. Peace secures what each person wants to acquire, while it allows him to avoid what he fears will give him pain. Hobbesian man is a calculating rascal, not a lofty one. He writes, thoughts are but scouts for the desires. Right? You're always looking for your opportunity to get what you desire. But this process of seeking what one desires is endless, since the attainment, as he writes, of one object only leads to the desire of the next object, and the pursuit goes on endlessly without rest. This he calls felicity, knowing no end when we're constantly in motion, chasing after desired objects. In a thoughtful treatment of this kind of analysis of the human enterprise, Thomas Spraggins writes, Machiavelli gives us a description of the rat race. Another major English thinker descended from Machiavelli is John Locke, of course, who, as Robert Goldwyn writes about his thought, thinks the following: man must be acknowledged to have a right to do what he is unable not to do. What counts is what is universal and powerful, what exists with a controlling force within every man, what can be relied on to govern our behavior. And what is that? Productive men desire to have things, more possessions, more property, and securing them through government, the great umpire. Even a day laborer with his subsistence wages is better off and more valuable, as Locke says, than the Indian roaming the plains of America. Reflecting on Locke's scheme, Leo Strauss observed that it results in a joyless quest for joy. It is a short step from the Hobbesian fear of pain and the Lockean emphasis on having property to Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism. The 18th century thought of Jeremy Bentham and his 19th century acolytes, James and John Stuart Mill, gave utilitarianism its name brand in philosophy. After briefly looking at them, I will leave it to you to ponder how to respond. You might find their thinking attractive, sensible, even self-evident. On the other hand, you might judge that as a culture's governing philosophy, it is a troubling sign of its weakened, slavish nature. In any case, it seems to me that we must get beyond economic utility, and the remedy begins when we labor to accept the gift of being free human beings. To undertake that labor requires that we refuse to limit ourselves to the pursuit of instrumental goods, that we cast off what Jeremy Bentham called the obvious empire of pleasure and pain, our two sovereign masters. Bentham begins his introduction to the principles of morals and legislation with the following assertion. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. Echoing Hobbes, he establishes his basis for ethical choice. This is Bentham. It is for them, pleasure and pain, alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine how we shall do it. Bentham goes on to say that the principle of utility, quote, recognizes this subjection and assumes it for the foundation of our lives, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and of law. Systems which attempt to question it deal in sounds rather than in sense, in caprice instead of reason, in darkness instead of light. It's so interesting that all these thinkers are offering, dressing up, as it were, happiness in an entirely new garb. Right? And what I'm suggesting is that when you take her clothes off, she's not very pretty. This fabric of felicity or happiness, which for Aristotle is the conformity of the soul to its own excellence, is lowered to the dictum that human beings' choices are governed, obviously, right, by their pursuit of pleasure or by their avoidance of pain. While Aristotle observes that men do indeed construe the good as what is pleasant or useful to them, he places pleasure and pain beneath the love of the noble, and the noble beneath the life of contemplation. Most people, Aristotle writes, do show themselves to be completely slavish by choosing a life that belongs to fatted cattle. When I see them on the hillsides in Wyoming, actually, they do look pretty happy. They chew their cud all day. It looks like uninterrupted bliss. But they are cattle. He adds that receiving honors, such as in politics, though higher, is dependent on the one who bestows the honors. But we, meaning Aristotle, divine that the good is something of one's own and hard to take away. But for Bentham, obeying the two masters of pleasure and pain ensures that one acts rationally and according to nature. In this train of modern thinkers, James Mill defends Bentham from his critics, who charged that Bentham eliminates philosophy and beauty. Mill's creed, quote, accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle. Those are his words. He guards the thought of Bentham as Cerberus guards hell. Mill begins his attempt to salvage utilitarianism by insisting that Bentham is not reducing human pleasure to the life of pigs. In his attempted rescue, however, Mill falls into a deeper error, it seems to me. His answer to Bentham's adversaries is that of two pleasures, one must be qualitatively better than the other, because, these are his words, all or almost all who have experienced those two pleasures give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling or moral obligation to prefer it. So in other words, what he is saying is, if you take two pleasures, and most people, without a moral compass to guide them, will say, oh, that pleasure is better than this pleasure. This one is higher than this one. Mill says the fact that without ethical guidance, people can decide on an aristocracy of pleasures, okay? But the problem is this, in my view. The hierarchy of pleasures is decided by the court of democracy. what is assessed by most men as better pleasures than others is decisive. In my generation, what was decided as the best pleasure is illegal in my country, right? Well, it's legal in a few states now, but do you see that this floating relativism of pleasures is not anchored in anything other than opinion, than the cave of Plato? Once down there, there's no way up, no way out. No one's going to unchain your feet and neck. No standard outside of what most people regard as pleasurable and thus worth pursuing, or as painful and thus worth avoiding. The cave becomes a bubble, impenetrable and sealed. Now, to be fair, Mill insists on the dignity of human beings. He looks at those who prefer a path that, even though painful, gives them a pleasure beyond money and sensual gratification. He would like a world where there are Socrateses. He would like a world where it's possible for there to be poets. But he gives us no way to either achieve that world or to sustain it. We know from the thought of Richard Rorty, John Rawls, and others in the 20th century that James Mill's defense of utilitarianism could not adequately support what he acknowledges as man's higher faculties. Predictably, the logic of his thought leads to the cultural dominance of majority tyranny, as Tocqueville describes the mass mind. A sign of leveling attachment to equality is its inability to distinguish among kinds of ethical paradigms. Rorty and Rawls, if I understand their meaning, conclude that what works best then is pluralism, since we can't dictate from an ethical norm outside our own horizon what the ought is. All we can do is jockey claims under a kind of agreement of pluralism. This, in my view, this teaching of pluralism is the latest facelift for democracy. It dictates now our ends of civil society. In Rorty and Rawls' view, the various groups and interests coalescing around some sort of agreement without reference to a higher law or to self-evident truths is the only workable solution to so many different ethical claims. It's not only that you and I are equal under this view, but it's also that what you and I think about the human things is equal. And since there isn't anything outside of our own opinion, then all we can do is come to some agreement, is pluralism. These so-called ethical claims, when one examines them, prove to be mere masks for pleasure and pain, desires posed as necessities. Mill, I suspect, would be disappointed. I suspect he would not find it possible for there to be noble feelings, as he puts it, noble feelings, as he said, which are like tender plants easily killed. As he puts it, these tender plants easily die if not nurtured. Well, it seems to me his kind of thought is precisely the kind that killed the plant. In acknowledging the critical importance that young people have a time and a place set apart for the contemplative life, let's call it the university. Even Mill, the sophistic defender of utilitarianism, shows the durability of the old-fashioned preferences that he worked so hard to undermine. So, now that we have reviewed the intellectual influences on our culture's preference for economic utility, I would like to turn to some examples of this mentality that have, I would call it, infected our culture. I presume that you are prepared, that your liberal arts education here will prepare you to see how these paths that we have chosen are questionable. And I will leave it to you to recover the disposition of leisure with the guidance of your professors, a disposition that can address this disease of our day. And I'm going to look at that book I mentioned earlier by Michael Sandel on what money can't buy. He writes at the beginning of his work that contemporary economic theory is trying to overcome every irrational obstacle to utility. He argues that our cultural gain, our cultural economic mode, if we put it that way, seeks to, quote, colonize every corner of our lives. I will limit his examples, though he has hundreds, to 3 areas: marriage, the household, and the city or the polis. These are the 3 levels or association you will recognize as partnerships, as associations in Aristotle's Politics. The governing principle in all of these 3 examples is that there is nothing so sacred that it can't be bought or sold, that it can't be assigned a market value. All right, so that's the principle. So let's start with marriage. Sandel cites Gary Becker's argument in the economic approach to human behavior, wherein he rejects, quote, the notion that economics is the study of the allocation of material goods. That's old-fashioned, Becker says. Sandel reviews the kind of thinking that totalizes all aspects of life under what I'm calling this economics of utility. This is Sandel. In all domains of life, human behavior can be explained by assuming that people decide what to do by weighing the costs and the benefits of the options before them, and choosing the one they believe will give them the greatest welfare or utility. People try to maximize their benefit, no matter what the content. It applies to choosing a mate or buying a can of paint. If men and women do not perceive their relationships this way, it is simply because they are blind to their real motives. Those with a keen eye, Sandel writes, summarizing Becker, can see that all of our behavior, however remote from material concerns, can be explained and predicted as a rational calculus of costs and benefits. Now, of course, prenuptial agreements fit this model. If you're going to marry an old man like Mike Douglas, it might be useful to have a prenup. I can understand what she was thinking. But prenuptial agreements aside, which fit so well the cost-benefit model, isn't it a bit harder to agree with his statement that in general, now this is Becker, a person decides to marry when the utility expected from marriage exceeds that expected from remaining single, or from additional searches for a more suitable mate. And then divorce, it's the other way, just the same thing. He concludes that since many persons are looking for mates, a market in marriages can be said to exist. Of course, you go on the internet, right? How many people you know go on the internet? And then when you hear the story later that so-and-so met so-and-so on the internet, you always feel, really? Oh, okay. I wonder if Becker's wife likes to think of herself as a good buy or a good deal. How different is that degradation of love, we might ask, than, say, Really, the slave markets in New Orleans, where beautiful quadroons and octoroons were sold for the pleasures and social esteem that their buyers coveted. Or how different than mail-order brides, so useful for the hard life on the lonely mountainsides of Wyoming or the Wild West. I do think some of those women are descended from mail-order brides. They're tough. Ooh. Can this kind of utilitarian analysis, which pervades my own discipline of political science, account for the fidelity of Penelope, waiting 20 years for Odysseus? Was that a cost-benefit analysis? Can it explain how Augustine's mother, Monica, prayed and forgave and tamed her abusive husband? Can Becker's cost-benefit analysis satisfy readers of The Tempest who witnessed Ferdinand's immediate love for Miranda? Can it analyze the beauty and enduring love of Kitty and Levin in Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, or countless other examples of love's dimensions? Becker would charge that these depictions of great lovers in fiction or in actual so-called selfless marriages satisfy a false sentimentality. So in one sweep, right, with a balance sheet, the courtly tradition, the lady, the power of the heart, the very first organ that develops in a human being, all of these are dismissed not as benefit entries on the balance sheet. They don't even make it there because they're not calculable. So let's move on to children, the next area. The low birth rates in Europe and now in the United States, the designer babies, the sperm banks, the host mothers, incentives for sterilization, the reality that in the United States, 90% of Down syndrome babies are aborted, indicate that Western peoples indeed, we are doing a cost-benefit analysis when it comes to both having children and selecting what kind we would prefer. It seems that in the field of biology, the ability to do certain things means it is morally acceptable to do them. We're reminded of Dante's warning, aren't we, in Canto 28 of Inferno, where he writes, I curb my talent, that it not run where virtue does not guide, so that if my kind star or something better has given me that gift, I not abuse it. In the 18th century, Jonathan Swift, in his modest proposal, suggested eating babies to solve the Irish problem, right? I mean, we would publish that now and nobody would know it was a satire. One could argue that there is little difference between that and lacerating them or sucking them out of their mother's wombs. Sandel doesn't touch the hot issue of abortion, by the way. But he does quote an American judge, a very prominent one in law and economics theory, Richard Posner, who says this: the use of markets to allocate babies, to put them up for adoption, is an untapped market. Why not auction babies? Right? He goes on to say that orphaned children who survive the selling will, of course, go to families who have more money. But that's how it should be, right? Under the economics of utility. Is something being degraded here? Corrupted, maybe? Diminished, at least? The economist I studied in college, Kenneth Boulding, suggested, this was way back in the 60s, right? Tradable procreation permits. You know how you trade carbon emission units now? Well, he suggested back in the 60s that once children become a luxury good, then we can go ahead and calculate how many children we want by allowing a certain number of permits for them. Well, of course, who's going to get to have the permits? The people who can pay for it, right? This is prudent. This is responsible. But what does it say to the child who comes to understand himself or herself as being worth so much? To be understood as a good calculation rather than the offspring of love and generosity. So many of my children's friends in the last 15 to 30 years have talked about themselves as mistakes, as if their parents flunked the math test and they now have to suffer the consequences of their miscalculation. This kid. Those children who do make it into the world provide the advertisers for whole new fields to plow. According to the theory of incentives articulated in Greg Mankiw's textbook, people respond to incentives, right? And production is kept high by incentives to increase segments of the population with fungible cash. And so Sandel gives example after example of using young children, preschool on up, as the newest, hottest market, right? So TV channels, which are for schools, just for schools, now are funded by big companies, which thereby get their premium spots in advertising on those closed networks. In Colorado, our neighbor state, a school district sells space on report cards to advertisers, right? So you get your grades on one side and then you get a McDonald's advertisement on the other. What would you say to such a school district and to the community that allows it? Is the domain of school just an opportunity for profit? Is there no freedom for the student to love learning for its own sake? Are students to think of themselves as markets for adults? A child might begin to deduce quite rightly that his education is not the point. Right? He is, using Heidegger's phrase, standing reserve for consumption, as trees in the forests are seen as pulp for paper. Trapped in the school building, is this child free or a slave? Well, there's so much to say about the reduction of civic life to incentives, markets, and the promotion of non-civic ends that one hardly knows where to begin. But Sandel worries, as I think we should, that self-interest rather than civic virtue and public spiritedness are governing how this public sphere conducts itself. The view is that virtue runs out. It's in limited supply, and so markets preserve the little value that's out there, the little bit of virtue, rather. Sandel cites the economist Kenneth Arrow. Economists typically take for granted that since the creation of a market increases the individual's area of choice, it therefore leads to higher benefits. Thus, if to a voluntary blood donor we add the possibility of selling blood, we have only expanded the individual's range of alternatives. If he desires satisfaction from giving, he can still give, and nothing has been done to impair that. But Sandel questions, as should we, whether commercializing the willingness to give blood changes the meaning of donating it. The thinking goes like this, that a desire for public service, disinterested generosity, a desire for the health of one's civic life and its institutions, could overwhelm self-interest and economic benefit. No, the thinking goes, that's unlikely. Selfless service doesn't exist very much, so let's not use it up. This approach to civic life and participation, I submit, is the recipe for the polity's demise. This is the sign of a diseased culture. Rousseau is quoted by Sandel in a very important passage, as he says, "In a well-ordered city, every man flies to the assemblies." He goes on, Rousseau, As soon as public service ceases to be the chief business of citizens, and they would rather serve with their money than with their persons, the state is not far from its fall. Sandel makes the powerful reply then to those who think we need to be paid to do good works with this: altruism, generosity, solidarity, and civic spirit are not like commodities that are depleted with use. They are more like muscles that develop and grow with exercise. One of the defects, then, of a market-driven society is that it lets these virtues languish. To renew our public life, we need to exercise them more strenuously. To conclude, Sandel has described precisely what Aristotle calls energeia when he talks about those muscles, the active exercise of the soul's conformity to its own excellence, an exercise vital to the health of culture. As the images and the paradigms of selfless civic virtue continue to recede, to go away from view, giving way to a utilitarian approach to education, young people will become more and more vulnerable to the calculus of others, opportunists who have determined just how little virtue you have and how they can be able to profit from it. I realize that one part of my talk to you this afternoon emphasized the sources of what I've been calling the disease of our culture, and the other suggested symptoms. What I have not done is mapped out a one-step solution, and I have not done so because that is not possible. It's not possible because real healing has to be holistic, and it takes time. Healing must occur at every level of our society. We who are in the academy can begin, at the very least, by protecting the integrity of our walls, by restoring what I will call our one superbly useful human muscle. This great capacity, like the muscles in our body, grows and deepens with use. It is memoria, memory. St. Augustine wrote, "The seat of the mind is memory." The academy at all levels must resuscitate memory and resituate itself in the memory of the great tradition of learning, so that the mind can undertake the labor of gratitude, which will make us worthy of it. And then we must give it away, larger than we found it. Thank you for your attention. Yes, I don't have any idea what time it is. I don't know if too long. Oh, it's up to you. Sure. Yes, I'd love to. Sure, I'll sit down. Thank you.
La doctora, Dr. Arbery was willing to take some questions. Si alguien quiere preguntar en español, con muchísimo gusto, háganlo y yo lo traduzco. Si se sienten a gustos en inglés, háganlo en inglés como ustedes quieran. Then I'll ask two professors to take the microphones, two of our microphones. Dos micrófonos, por favor. ¿Me ayudas? Y dale el otro. ¿Tú por este lado? Y el profesor.
Buenos días a todos.
Oh, okay, where's the... Oh, there you are.
Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Good
Buenas tardes.
afternoon.
Buenas tardes.
I want to congratulate you because so far I've been 4 years and a half. I'm about to finish here, and so far I remember I haven't heard I don't know, a talk which consists more than informative about the market outside or economics or such stuff, technicisms. It was more formative or constructing for us. Personally, I found myself pretty identified with such an ideology. So, yes, I mean, we live in a culture where we reject, or we cannot reject what our environment asks us to be, and we reject to embrace who we really are. So that's mainly your point, and yeah, I write about that. So that's why I found myself pretty identified. Yes, in a society which celebrates liberalism and freedom, we are slaves of following what everyone wants to be, or wants to be one day, to be successful, as we call to have success in life, no? So my point is, how could we in a community here in the university, how could we train these muscles in order to not get, I would say, sick? I call it sickness. In your terms, it would be spiritual pollution. No? Yes, that's my question, and I think everyone is interested on. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. I think you are all called to be very brave, because you have to be countercultural. When I was growing up, being countercultural meant sleeping around and smoking dope and disobeying the rules, and it was easy. But now you have to be very brave, because you have to block out so much that is false. But you have to do very well what is expected of you. Because if you aren't successful, you won't be heard. So you have to be as wise as serpents and cunning. Right? You have to be cunning. You have to protect your inner life by studying with great devotion the works that teach you how to be human, and with great obedience and steadfastness, you must do what is expected of you. I don't think you can all become, as during the time of St. Augustine, desert fathers. You could come to Wyoming with my husband and me, and we'll find you a cave in a mountain. I mean, that was one solution, but you will have to find that inner space through great study and also great competence, so that you can be heard. Then, when you are powerful, you will have reading groups, you will have retreats, you will change the schools, you will make sure that what is worth preserving is preserved, and you will bring more to it. And when the economic forms devolve, which I think they might, truly, you will have something that will last and be able to help reshape our culture.
Well, thank you for the talk. It's really refreshing to hear something like this in this institution. Though we actually learn from this authors, and we actually teachers ask or make us ask ourselves this kind of questions. But it was interesting to see you as an American, because we've seen from Mexico that America is more of a market-driven, not just an economy, but an idiosyncrasy. So, as a Mexican, I have to ask, do you think that our culture is more inclined to lose the ability to use such muscles as you talked about as an American is, or is it almost the same?
Well, I am ignorant of your culture, and I have one experience, and it was yesterday, and it was at Tepeyac and Our Lady of Guadalupe, and I think if it's possible for such a place, for so many people to go through such sacrifice to thank her, I think your culture is healthier than ours. I hope our culture can learn from the many immigrants who are there. I would feel that your school preserves something that should be preserved throughout your culture. I was dismayed to learn of the teacher strikes, the fact that teachers would disobey the law and give such a bad example. I think in that respect you have a challenge. I would say we need to learn from, as St. Thomas Aquinas said, the simple people. The simple people teach us something that the academy cannot. And that's what I saw yesterday. That looked very healthy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I wanted to, thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, and as he was saying, we always come to listen to people talk about fiscal laws, and the auditorium is full, and I think it's really good for everyone that's here to listen to what you said. And I wanted to ask your perspective on how young people have this lack of searching for spirituality, or what's your insight on the religious view of the young people nowadays? Is it lack of interests, or is it that we don't have like a technical way of proving it or of experimenting it? Like, what's your insight on the religious stuff in young people?
I go with Faulkner. You know, in 1950, I was born in 49. He is, as Romano Guardini and Pieper, all these people, after World War II, everyone was so disillusioned. And yet these were great thinkers who had hope in the young. I have great hope in the young. I see the young making countercultural choices all the time. I hope that the virtue that's needed so much today, which is courage and long suffering, is being cultivated in some way by the hard work that you do to be successful. I'm thinking that that hard work can be translated into courage in another venue, a kind of spiritual courage. Anything that's deformed, that is a disease, can be a strength. Disease, how we suffer, how we are not whole, is often a strength. And so I think this could be made a strength if you can turn the hard work, into the courage that it takes to be countercultural, to be fully human. I don't see how you can be fully human without the spiritual. The ancients understood that too. I live in a very sheltered environment. The students we have are so much better than we are. They're so much better. It's hard to be around them. No, it really is. I think young people can take the lead, because you know what you can do? You can do something very counterintuitive. You can make older people ashamed. And you see a good young person, shame isn't appropriate for the old, but you start to blush because you realize they are pure and they are full of hope, and we have lost that. So I have hope.
Hi, my name is Carolina, and my question is, do you think it is possible to reach a powerful position without having to choose between being a real human or having to hide some traits from you in order to get to power and then work for something better for humanity? I mean, from my point of view, you got to give up a lot of things to get into a powerful position, and some of those things might be what started your walk into I don't know, your work for a better place. So you might get lost. What do you think?
That's a beautiful question, and it reminds me of your question too. I think I don't mean to say that you shouldn't do very well in your professional advancement, and that you shouldn't be head of everything that you undertake to do. You should be leaders. I mean to say that you have to be so careful to protect that inner freedom, to protect the silence, to nurture just as hard your insides, your spiritual muscles, as you are your equipment to be successful in the world. I think it's very dangerous to try to be successful for the inner life, and this is why I say you have to be so brave, because it will take great courage to preserve both the interior life and to be successful. There's a lot of talk recently, isn't there, about failure and how helpful failure is for growth? I think we should remember that too, because sometimes it's in failing to do the things that you think have to be done that we find what we should really do.
Hi. I wanted to thank you for the talk, and I wanted to ask, you said at the end that they may not be a solution for the sickness of our civilization, because it should be holistic in all the levels of our society. In which ways should our actions should be headed to for like trying to solve this, to even try to solve this sickness of the civilization?
Well, I appreciate how well you listened. I was afraid everybody would fall asleep. But, you know, my children used to say, I can't believe you're a teacher because you have such a lullaby voice. It puts us to sleep. So thank you for listening. What can you do? I think my answer would be, how can I be? Not so much what can I do, but how can I be in this world? In my schedule, with my duties, what space can I find to feed the deepest part of myself? Meditation, prayer, always reading poetry and philosophy. Never letting go this precious humanities program that you have, but pursuing it your whole life. Those are the things that will feed you. And then you have your imagination. I can't tell you in your realm how you can turn a utilitarian perspective into a human one. But you will see if you're living that deeper life. You will see. And it's different in each circumstance. First of all, it seems to me what you do is do something that none of us are doing very well in our world, which is listen. Be attentive. Shut out all the extra noise, but be attentive.
My question is also about the last part you said about there is no solution to this diseased society. But why can't there be a solution? I mean, it has to be in all the levels as you said, it has to be holistic. But why can't we make schools have an education, a human education? I mean, why can't that be a solution?
Well, I want to say with you, why not? It'd be so easy. Yeah. So I agree with you in the spirit of your question. There are vested interests in keeping you enslaved. There are vested interests in keeping children, little children, just geared for a technical education. In our country, at the top level, our Department of Education is promoting what's called a Common Core. The Common Core is the requirement from grammar school all the way through high school. And it leaves out the arts. There is hardly any place for literature. There's no place for philosophy. And those of us in the academy who see this being imposed on little children are trying to fight it. I belong to an organization called the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars, which are trying to fight it. Well, we could say, it's useless, it's never going to change. But it can change, because in our country we have charter schools which are taking over, and they are excellent for the most part, and they are restoring the classical tradition. And I'll tell you something funny. The schools that are independent and are trying to restore classical learning, they are going to people who have studied Thomas Aquinas, who have studied Latin, because they don't know it. They don't have it in their background. So the more of the great ancient works, medieval works you know, this is interesting, the more marketable you will become.
Hi. My question is, while I was listening to your talk, I couldn't help think about the teachers that don't want to work, or congressmen that fall asleep, during work. So America definitely is like focused on productivity, but is Mexico really like that? I mean, I don't know. It's just a question that comes to my mind, because maybe our social circle, but it's small. I mean, this is a small university, and not all of the universities are like this, like focused on the productivity. I can't help but think of the people that really don't want to work. I mean, all of the millions of kids that are out of school because there's teachers on strike. So that might be a problem for developed countries, but maybe, I don't know if that is a generalized problem in our culture.
Oh, our teachers are pretty good in America. Even in the public schools, my husband used to head an academy for teachers, and they would come to us to read great books and not go to the teacher programs that taught them methods and other boring education classes. But they would really come to us to learn the great books. Oh, I don't know what happened. Unions should not organize, it doesn't seem to me, people who live a life of service. Can you get rid of your unions? Oh, well, great books. Matthew Arnold says we should read the best that has been known and thought in the world. So we don't want to leave out Plato, Aristotle, right? We don't want to leave out Shakespeare, so on. So these teachers have come to us to learn what they should have learned in college, what they should have had in a humanities program like yours, and they didn't. And so they come to us. So they have a desire to give something real to their students, but they're up against a structure which requires them to prepare their students to take tests. All it is tests. Do you know the facts? And that's not an education. So in your country, I'm not sure if you also have that problem. Is it just the unions, or is it also what the teachers study when they become teachers? They don't get a liberal arts education, do they? No. No. This is a problem.
Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering about this thing you said that now we just think about the optimization of utilities and happiness and that stuff, and that's the way we think about, like you mentioned this guy who says that every human decision is driven and made by that process, and I'm wondering like what's wrong with that, because even like if you think of Aristotle, said that the maximum happiness for him was to just observe the truth. So you could think of that as a way of, he was like maximizing his happiness by doing that, right? So like what's the, like I don't quite get the problem in that thing you mentioned.
That's the pleasure first, or do we think about the substance that conveys the pleasure? Is it the case that there are some things intrinsically worthier of our attention than others? And that's a judgment that the utilitarians can't make, because they have no horizon outside of the personal experience. In the older understanding, there's a larger horizon, and it calls us to it because it is higher. And yes, it gives us pleasure. Yeah.
We would like to thank Virginia Lombardo Arbery. She left a small town in Wyoming a few days ago to come and meet you, and we are very thankful. She drove 6 hours, then she took a plane, and we met around 12 at night on Wednesday. She might be a little tired, so we should go to lunch maybe. We want to thank her with a very warm applause, please. Le vamos a entregar un diploma y agradecer que estuvo con nosotros.
Muchas gracias. Oh, you're beautiful.
Now review.
This is my new baby.